Hey friends, and welcome back to another tier list video. Today I'm going to go through Black's responses against the Ruy Lopez, which is White's most popular opening choice against 1e5. I'm going to outline all the different options you have, so you can choose which one best suits yourself. If you enjoyed the content, please consider dropping a like down below, and if you've been here a few times already, then you can hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you get notifications every time I upload a new video. But other than that, let's jump into the list. So before we get into the mainline Ruy Lopez, Black has a number of ways to deviate as early as move 2, and we'll look through each of these first, starting with knight f3 queen e7, also known as the Gunderam defense. This is Black's attempt at going for a setup approach with his pieces. For example, after knight c3, Black will put the pawn on c6, preventing knight d5, and then he'll follow up with the move pawn to d6 and fianchettoing his kingside pieces. In general, this will work in faster time controls, but it's hard to play in classical chess. So because of this, I'll put it in the just tricks pile. The next one on the list we have is f5, known as the Latvian Gambit. So this is Black's approach at trying to steer the game into some complications and tricky lines. The problem with this is White does have a clear path of getting an advantage if he knows what he's doing, and because of this reason, I probably have to put it at the bottom. So next on the list we have is d6. This is the Philidors defense, and you can play it with the move knight d7 or play it with the move knight f6. So both are totally fine, but they both lead to very cramped positions. And because of this reason, it's going to be lower than the ones later on in the list. If you do play it and want some open positions, then I would suggest you play the knight f6 version and then bishop e7. This can get into some complications later on, but in general it's a playable line. So next on the list we have is knight to f6, which is also known as the Petroff. After the move knight takes, we play d6 and then knight takes e4. This is a reputation of very solid opening, but it can be very dry as well, but it deserves to be at the very top. So a deviation just before this actually is knight to c6, which is the Stafford Gambit, which has sort of come into popularity a lot recently as well. After the move knight takes e6, Black will capture back with the d pawn, and White can play knight c3 or pawn to d3, which is the most common. Bishop c5, and here if White isn't careful, then Black has a number of different tricks involving bishop takes f2. So as long as you don't play c3 or h3 here, you should be okay. The best move is to go bishop to e2, and Black can try knight g4 or h5, which has been tried a number of times as well, followed by knight g4. And as long as you don't castle kingside into an attack and follow up the move pawn to c3, you should be totally fine here. And I view this as more as just an opening that you'll play in faster time controls or trying to trick your opponent. Definitely not a long-term solution. So another one on this list we have is the move pawn to d5. So this is also known as the Elephant Gambit. So in general, any opening named after an animal is usually not a good sign, and this probably is the worst one on this list. So next we're going to go through some of the deviations on move 3 and 4 before we head into the main lines. Okay, so now we get into knight f3, knight c6 lines. After bishop b5 we enter the Ruy Lopez, and here before we look into the a6 variations, Black has a number of different responses here. Starting with the move pawn to f5, which is the Schlimann. So this one in general I feel is a very underrated opening. If you like complications and you want dynamic positions to try and get some tactics going, then this could be the opening for you. I actually think this is a very good opening, so I'm going to put it quite high on this list. The next one we have is the move knight to f6, also known as the Berlin defense. So this in general is a very high tier opening. It's difficult to learn, but it can be extremely solid and hard to crack, mainly played at the very high level of chess, and it's not seen so much when you're starting out, since I think there are better options for you to play. But in general, this opening belongs at the very top for sure. Next we have is the move pawn to g6, which is also known as the Smyslov Defense. So after g6, I think white can just follow up with either knight c3 d4 or pawn to c3 d4. And in general, I feel that having the move a6 included is a better version. So because of this, I'm going to put it a little bit lower. Next we can play is pawn to d6, which is the Stenitz. So this is again similar to the previous one I mentioned, that I think it's better to have a6 included. So because of this, I'm also going to put it a little bit lower. And then we have the move knight to e7. And then we have the move knight to e7 on move 3, which is the Cozio defense. So this one, again, I'm going to put it in sort of the just tricks pile, because I think there are better options. So the classical is bishop to c5 on move 3. So this one is played a lot at the beginning level because black is yet to sort of work out any specific defenses. The idea is that white can't capture here because of just a common trap where you can take on f2, or you can play the move queen to d4 here, hitting the pawns here and winning them back. So in general, I feel this is very easy to play against, and black doesn't get too much here. So I put it somewhere at the bottom. And then we get into knight to d4, which is also known as the bird defense. So I believe after knight takes, pawn takes, a lot of people will castle here with the white pieces, and black's position is okay there, but I think it's more accurate to first put the bishop on c4. And in general, I'm not a big fan of these positions with black, although I know they have been played before. It probably belongs in the just tricks pile as well. Okay, so now we're going to get into our mainline options. So after the move pawn to a6, bishop goes back to a4, and here again black can play some of the opening options we looked at earlier, but with a6 included, starting with the move knight to e7. So I actually quite like this move order by pushing the bishop to a4 first. Let's say white plays c3. Black's main setup here involves playing g6 and something along the lines of this, where black will castle the king to the king side, maybe play d6 c5, maybe push the pawn to d5, and maybe play h6 f5. So there are quite a number of options here, and it tends to lead to more sharper and dynamic play. So if you enjoy something like this but want to avoid the mainline openings on this list, then this could be one for you to try out. So next we have pawn to d6 on move 4, which is the Stenitz, but the delayed version. So I've played this quite a number of times, and I really like this version. After pawn to c3, black is intending to play bishop d7 and play the knight to f6 and get some position like this where he's fianchetted the pieces on the king side right away, instead of having to do that long-winded Ruy Lopez maneuver with the bishop going to f8. And in general, we just have a standard and a healthy Ruy Lopez middle game position. And in general, I quite like this, so I'm going to put it a little bit higher on this list. So another one we can play here is knight to f6, and after castles, we can play knight takes e4, which is the open defense. So after this, white will often answer with pawn to d4, pawn to b5, bishop goes to b3, pawn goes to d5, captures bishop e6, and this has been played a lot at the top level previously, but lines become very, very forcing, and it has been looked at quite extensively. But if you enjoy these type of positions, then definitely have a look at it, and I would put it somewhere around the top. So next we have bishop to e7, rook to e1, which is going into the main lines. After b5, bishop to b3, black will castle, pawn goes to c3 here, and here in this position black can play the move pawn to d5, which is the start of the martial attack, which involves sacrificing a pawn after captures, knight takes e5, knight takes, rook takes, pawn goes to c6. We see that white's pieces are somewhat stuck on the queen side, and black will play the bishop to d6 and then start some sort of attack on the king side. So black doesn't have compensation for his sacrificed material, but this line does involve you knowing a lot of theory, and you really have to know what you're doing, especially in the middle games and end games, in order to justify your pawn sacrifice. But if you're willing to put in the work, then this can be a line that's definitely worth it. In general, people used to play this for a win and the Berlin for a draw, but more recently I feel that people have been playing the Berlin for a win, and then because the lines in the martial have been so worked out, then it's not becoming as popular as once used to be. There's also quite a number of ways that we can deviate from the martial early on. For example, white can play the move pawn to h3, which you can't play d5 here because the pawn sacrifice is not as good, but if you want to go for it anyway, you can play bishop b7 first, d3 and then d5. This has been played before and I think black has had some success. But white can also play the move pawn to a4, which is another anti-martial opening, and after b4 we get into somewhat different positions from the d5 ones before. So white can steer you away from your comfort zone if they want to. So just be aware of that if you're going to play something like this. But in general, the opening itself is a top tier opening. So next we'll go into some of the d6 openings after move 8. So d4 here is met by the move bishop to g4, by the way. So we won't be looking at this. Instead we're looking at pawn to h3, which is white stopping this, and this will head into some of the mainline options for black. So we'll start with the move knight to d7, which is also known as the Karpov variation. After the move knight d7, bishop goes to f6, and black will maybe put the knight on b6 and maybe put the bishop on b7. It really depends on what happens here, but in general these structures are very, very passive, I find, and very, very hard to play. So because of this reason, I'm going to put the Karpov variation a little bit lower. So next we have the Zaitsev. So the Zaitsev happens after h3, and then we play the move bishop to b7, d4, and then rook to e8. So the problem with this move order is that white can opt for a draw if he wants to with knight g5, and you have to play rook f8 and then just play knight f3. And the only way to avoid this is to play the move pawn to h6 and then play rook e8, bishop goes to f8, and fianchettoing the kingside pieces. So in general, this is a very classical way to play the position, and black is just leaving a lot of options open of where he wants to put his pieces. So there's nothing wrong with this opening at all. So next we have the Chigorin defense. So after h3, black will play the move knight to a5, bishop goes back to c2, and then pawn to c5, grabbing space in the center. White can answer with the move pawn to d4, and here we get into a lot of different options for black. So one option for black is to play knight d7. So I believe this is called Keres or something similar, where black will capture here and play knight back to c6, pawn goes here, and then we'll get some sort of positions like this where white might play f4. And in general, I don't really like this particular line because I feel that it's been worked out to be quite good for white as far as I know, and you really have to be booked up to play this particular line. So if you play the Chigorin, I would probably suggest sticking to more of the mainline options after the move queen to c7. But the main problem that you'll encounter is that this knight on a5 is often stuck and never really gets into the game if you're not careful about it. So because of this reason, I put it a little bit lower, but it has been played quite a lot as well. So next on this list we have the Breyer, which happens after the move pawn to d6. pawn to h3 again, and then black will play the move knight to b8. So a strange looking move, but the idea is to improve on the Chigorin, where the knight is often misplaced on a5, and instead black is immediately going to reroute it to d7 and put it on a much better square to begin with. So black often gets very solid positions here, and it's relatively easy to play with not much theory. So compared to most of the other openings on this list, I feel that it's much easier to learn. So because of this, I'm going to put it quite high. Probably it's borderline top 2, but I'm going to put it at the very top. And lastly, we have the defenses involving bringing the bishop out to c5. So let's go back to the very start. And here, after the move knight f6 castles, the first one is bishop to c5 right away, which is called the Neo-Archangel. So as far as I know, this is perfectly playable again, and white will often answer with the move pawn to c3 d4. But if you're not careful, after the bishop drops back to a7, you can often be met with the move bishop to g5, and it's very hard to unpin. And if you unpin incorrectly, then you can be met with all sorts of sacrifices with knight takes g5, and your kingside can come under a lot of attack really quickly. So just because it's not so easy to play, I'm going to put it a little bit lower. So the better version, I think, is to play pawn to b5 first, and after bishop b3 then play bishop c5. So this is the Archangel defense, and this leads to very sharp and very forcing lines. So if you enjoy this, then you should opt for this type of opening. There is a lot of theory to it though, but I definitely think it's worth it. So that rounds out my tier list on the Ruy Lopez. Basically, there are two approaches you can take. You can either go for a slightly worse position and try to outplay your opponent, or you can go directly for equalization and take it from there. Either way, it's a perfectly fine approach to take. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.